I'm Laura Bradbury. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I work with Caring Connections up at the University of Utah. Caring Connections is a hope and comfort and grief program. And so we're a small nonprofit housed in the College of Nursing, although Taryn and I here are both social workers. And what we do is we provide grief support to grieving people, but I think our bigger mission is actually to educate other professionals, to educate clinicians, students, and other folks who interface with grieving people. So one of the things that we recognized after 20-something years of running the Caring Connections program and offering grief support is that there's always a need for grief support. That's not something that ever goes away. And so while we can provide what we can provide up at the U, it was just it felt like a greater mission to just train more people to be competent and skilled in grief and loss. So that's why we're doing this, and that's just what I love. So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. A going to spend the morning with you. We're going to be talking about grief, particularly the grief that people may experience after a sudden or unexpected death, which I imagine is much of what you all interface with. We'll go over just some grief education, some sort of basics about grief and loss. We'll talk about grief literacy, and we'll end the day. We'll end the morning, our portion of the day, with some self-care practices. So that's kind of what we hope. Since we're a little bit late getting started, I might breeze through a few things, but I promise, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to bring those up. We do want to tailor this to y'all as much as possible. So if I skip over a few things, but you have questions about them, please just let me know, and we'll take the time for it. Okay. So I wanted to share this image here. This outlines one of the ways most people in Utah die. And so over here we have some trajectories for what we would call an expected or anticipated death. Up at the top, that first graph there, that describes what often happens when it's a death due to cancer. Oftentimes a person, they may be doing reasonably well, sort of maybe just like a stable or very slow decline, until they get to a point where they're not able to pursue more treatment. They've exhausted their treatment options, and oftentimes at that point the decline is pretty rapid. So that's cancer. This slide in the middle, this describes mostly like heart failure, lung failure. What this often looks like for people is they're doing okay, maybe just ever so slight declines that are almost not noticeable, and then they might have an acute event that causes a bigger decline. They bounce back from that, but usually don't recover to where they were before, and so you see this sort of gradual decline that's punctuated by these acute events until they get to a point where the acute event is one that they can't fully bounce back from, and that's what leads to death. And then down here we have what often occurs with frailty or dementia, just advancing age, those kind of things. Just sort of a gradual, steady, can often take years or decades, decline that eventually leads to death. So this is really like most of the people who die of an illness kind of follow a trajectory that looks pretty similar to this. So, but what we're going to talk about today are sudden and unexpected death. So that might be a sudden death because of an acute health event, an accident, overdose, or suicide, homicide. And so when we talk about those things, we don't get this graph. We don't get these nice little images that outline what this looks like for a lot of people. Instead, it is pretty out of the blue, pretty unexpected, and there's not really a tidy little image to describe that. And so what we're going to talk about are a couple of different deaths and just some of what we know about what's going on with them. So first we'll talk about overdose, we'll talk about suicide, we'll talk about deaths from COVID and other things. And these slides come from the state, and so this first slide just indicates of drug overdose deaths involving any drug here in the state of Utah in between 2018 and 2022. So we are seeing there's some ebb and flow, and it has been sort of on the slow decline in the last couple of years, but largely stable. So over here we have the number of deaths, and then we have the years as they go by. So in 2022, over on the far end, we do see that we're at least to some extent on a little bit of a downhill, which is good news. A little bit of information about, here in our state, we live in a rural state. We live on tribal lands. Rates of drug overdose among American Indians and Alaska Natives has risen gradually over the last 20 years. We don't have specific data for each tribe in the state of Utah because they own their own data, and so the information we have is aggregate data combined from all the tribes. But we do see that that's a significant challenge, and that increase is something that we really are trying to do something about. So now I'll talk just a little bit about suicide. As I imagine this is not news to you all, but suicide deaths have increased over the past 20 years here in the state of Utah. We are at a point where where this can feel like a crisis. There's a lot going on, and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, 2021, we're still feeling the effects of that in people's mental health and in our suicide deaths. So, but again, we do see, while we've seen these pretty sharp increases, we are starting to see some slow decreases, and that I think we owe a lot to increased awareness, the prevalence of suicide prevention programs, the supports that are becoming more and more available. We do still have a long way to go, but I think we are moving slowly in the right direction. Again, I don't think this is going to be surprising information for you, but men do die of suicide at higher rates than women. So this blue line up here, this is male suicides. This orange line down here, this is female. Rates for both, however, have increased over time. So this is a problem that affects all genders. Those who identify as American Indian die at a rate of suicide nearly twice that of the general population. So this graph breaks it down by race. So we have here white, non-Hispanic, Black or African Americans, and then you see that higher number is our native populations. So this is again a group that we're trying to pay extra close attention to and really increase our advocacy efforts for. In our state, it can be hard to picture this when we are in a place like Salt Lake or Murray, but we are a rural state, and we have a lot of areas that are pretty remote, pretty far-flung, and we recognize that suicide rates are higher among rural areas. And so here in Utah, we have three designations, actually. We have the urban, which is essentially where we are now, rural, which is kind of like what you think of when you think of rural, and then very rural, which used to be called frontier, which are those areas that are a couple hundred miles away from a health center, those places that are really limited in resources. So again, rural areas is another area where we are trying to focus some concerted attention on in suicide prevention efforts. Here in the state of Utah, veterans comprise about 5.2% of our population. However, they also account for 12% of the suicide deaths. So they are overrepresented in suicide losses. Again, I doubt this is a surprise, but just talking about means and methods for suicide, firearms account for really the vast majority of them. That's that gray section. The other sections that are there are asphyxiation and poisoning. So because we are a state, because we're a remote state, because we're a Western state, we have because we like our guns here in the state, firearms do tend to be a prevalent method of suicide. And so little prevention efforts that we can make, like we hand out gun locks, encourage folks to carry those in their car, advocate for gun safety, all of those things are little steps that are taking us in the right direction. And again, just information about American Indians, Alaska Natives. Like we said, suicide rates have increased there. A lot of the folks who identify as American Indian live in these rural areas, so they're sort of double at risk because of their remote location and because of their racial identity. All right, so, and COVID-19, we'll talk about this. We are in 2024. We are no longer masking and social distancing, but we are still feeling the after effects of the pandemic. And I believe in terms of mental health that we'll be feeling those for quite some time. And so, so deaths are still happening from COVID-19, and they do often still fall under this category of sudden and unexpected because of the unpredictable ways that COVID can move through us. So, what we've recognized is that as grief professionals is that this pandemic created a tremendous amount of grief, and the aftermath of that is something that we're continuing to feel. And I interface with grieving people every day, and this is still something that's very real on the forefront of people's minds. Like this little image here, this sort of outlines the phases of the pandemic, and so so we have this pink line here. That indicates the first wave of the pandemic. You can probably kind of remember that. That was like March of 2020. Everyone go home. Everyone stay away from one another, and I don't know if you remember this in the same way that I do, but that first month or two was not terrible. It was kind of like, okay, we're all gonna like rally together. We can do this. We can hunker down for 3 weeks. We'll be fine. And then we know what happened, and things took a lot longer than a couple weeks to rebalance themselves. So that pink line is that first wave, and this was the immediate. How do we protect these people? How do we keep ourselves safe? How do we keep our families safe? And that immediate rise in sudden illnesses and deaths. And then this second wave, this green line here, this was what started to happen when as time had passed, and we all started to realize, hey, this is not returning back to normal anytime soon. And we started to realize that people were losing access to other resources because of the pandemic, because all the resources were being sent to that acute need. We were limited on like other non-urgent situations, mental health situations, those kind of things. So that's that second wave. The third wave, the impact of interrupted care on chronic conditions. So, these are people who maybe were dealing with health concerns even before the pandemic, but had limited access to their doctors, had limited access to the medications that they may have needed, those kind of things. And then finally, that fourth wave, which is kind of where I think we've been in for a little while. This is the psychological impact of the pandemic on people, the mental trauma, the economic impacts, the burnout, the fact that medical professionals and mental health professionals left their field because of the effects of the pandemic, all those kind of things. So we're still sort of sitting in that fourth wave. I'd like to believe we're moving away from it, but that's about where we're at these days. And one of the things that is pretty normal and really pretty healthy for grieving people to do is to kind of go back to the story of the death and tell it and retell it. They may revisit it in their mind. They may feel a need or an urge to share it with other people. But in that revisiting the story of the death, and that telling and retelling, that's a healthy, good thing for people to do. But it does also, I think, create some of these moments of like this, of recognizing this was a turning point. Here was a choice that I made. Could I have made a different choice? So while revisiting the story of the death is generally a good, therapeutically beneficial thing, it does kind of create this side effect of uncovering things that could have been done differently. It's sort of like I used to call it I used to call it the detective brain. So it is sort of like going back through all the little details, like kind of pulling things apart and looking at things and examining things from different angles. And with that, almost inevitably, we uncover a choice that could have been made differently. Doesn't necessarily mean it would have changed anything, but we do uncover forks in the road where we could have gone a different route. And so like Taryn said, that can create a lot of that self-doubt, a lot of that, not like, ah, crap, I caused this, I did something to this. And that's something that we can work with people around those kind of feelings. Well, there's a few more slides on that, but it is just a really hard thing that people go through. And it's a natural thing. So our job is really to help them, to support them as they navigate all that. So some of the things that grievers experience, first of all, especially in the case of a sudden or unexpected death, this sense of shock. Like, oh my goodness gracious, what is happening? This is completely out of the blue. And as healthcare professionals, there's been times where, so I worked in hospice for about 10 years. There's times where I was thinking, of course they're anticipating this death. This person has been on hospice for a very long time. This person has signed a do not resuscitate order. We know that they're going to die, but it can still be shocking to the family. And so that's the thing that's kind of the key point here is this is all as perceived by the friends or family of the person who died, not necessarily what's medically accurate. Like, there's nothing quite like a doctor saying, well, yeah, of course, we told you that they had 3 months to live. That doesn't necessarily help a person who's feeling shocked in that immediate aftermath. So there's this sense, and oftentimes, even in the case of a sudden or unexpected death, there may also have been a feeling of like having dreaded this day. We see this a lot with folks who lose someone to an overdose or to suicide, where they didn't know that this was going to happen. It's still very sudden, but they've had some concern about this, or they've had some scares in the past. So a sense of shock and unexpectedness, but also a sense of, I've dreaded this day. I thought this could happen, and now it's happening. So both of those kind of pair together to create that feeling of shock. Guilt, this is a big one. I think we were talking a little bit about this one. This is those feelings of like, I could have done something to prevent this. Something I did or didn't do caused this event to happen. There may be like this sense of what it says here, that self-attribution of guilt. It's my fault that they had a mental illness. It's my genetics that I passed along to them that caused this to happen, or my relationship with them, or my parenting skills, or those kind of things. It's not necessarily totally realistic, but it's very much there. And then there may also be grievers who feel some relief. They may feel some relief that their person is no longer suffering, some relief that the caregiver burden is gone, but that sense of relief is often pretty immediately paired with a sense of guilt. I can't believe I had that thought. I can't believe I'm feeling relieved that they died. That I'm a terrible person. Those kind of feelings. So one of the things that I recommend when working with someone or talking to someone who's describing a sense of guilt, I suggest helping them parse out the differences between guilt and regret. Where regret is this sense of, if I had known then what I know now, I may have made a different choice. Where guilt is more a sense of like, I did something wrong. I did something to cause this. So I'll share an example from my clinical practice. So I had a client many years ago who she came to me after her dad died, and her dad had died fairly suddenly after a really quick moving illness. And she said to me, the Sunday before he died on a Wednesday, the Sunday before he died, we were over there for Sunday dinner, and he was okay. He was moving around, but he just wasn't feeling good. And so after dinner, we were sitting down in the living room, and he was trying to describe his symptoms to me. And I was distracted because I was playing Candy Crush on my phone. This was like in 2010 when Candy Crush was a thing. And, and she said, I just kind of like brushed him off. I was like, oh, Dad, I'm sure you're fine. Let me just level up here. I just gotta beat this level. And 3 days later, he had died. And so she came to me a couple months down the road and she said, I treated him so badly. That was the last day that I saw him, and I just ignored him. I'm a terrible daughter. I can't believe that I would dismiss my dad like that. And so she was describing what felt to her like a tremendous amount of guilt. But what we worked on, what we started to recognize after a while, was that she was judging her past self on what her present self knew. And so, so if she had known that Sunday that would be the last conversation with her dad, she probably would have put the phone down and engaged with him in a different way. And she knew that. But it took a little bit for her to be able to acknowledge that. So she went from, so what we worked on and where she eventually got was she went from, I'm a terrible daughter because I ignored my dad on the last conversation I had with him, to most of the time I was a loving, attentive daughter, and I wish that I had connected with him better on that last day. So both of those are kind of hard things to live with, but which one do you think is a little easier to live with? The second one. So that's one way to kind of help somebody navigate feelings of guilt is, first of all, parse out, are you feeling guilty because you actually did something that was, truly wrong or truly a violation of your moral code? Or are you feeling guilty that you didn't have the ability to predict the future? Are you feeling guilty that you didn't have the ability to, make somebody do something differently? Those kind of things. That's more unrealistic guilt that usually falls more into that category of regret. And for a lot of people, being able to understand the difference between those two is really powerful. Now, if you may have somebody that you connect with who perhaps they do have something that they feel a more realistic sense of guilt around. And that's also something that we can work with. So I'll share one more example. I had another client who his wife had died, and he had been her longtime caregiver. She had dementia, had been bedbound for years. He was also, they were both elderly. They were both pretty frail, but he was the caregiver for the two of them. And he had a few times shortly before she died where he was less than gentle with how he handled her care, where he handled her kind of roughly, not in a way that was painful, but just in a way that wasn't really the husband that he wanted to be, wasn't really the caregiver that he wanted to be. And he came to me after his wife died, and he said, I can't believe that I treated my wife in such a way right before she died. I can't believe that I couldn't like hold myself together and treat her the way that she deserved to be treated in those final weeks. And so that was an example of a guilt that was maybe a little more realistic. He kind of violated what it meant to him to be a good husband, to be a good caregiver. But it was also really important in that moment to look at the bigger context, like to look at what was actually going on with him, which was he was under a tremendous amount of stress. He was not sleeping. He was exhausted. He was simply not his best self. And that's unfortunate. It was unfortunate for both of them. But he got to a place where he was able to say, those final couple weeks were not an indicator of our whole relationship. Those final couple weeks were an indicator of the incredible amount of stress that we were both experiencing. And that was painful. And that's something that he may have to live with. But he worked to get to a place where he could remember their whole marriage instead of that one little piece of it. And that got him to a place where he was able to say kind of the same thing. Most of the time I was a doting husband. Most of the time I was a loving father. We had a strong, healthy relationship, and I wish that I had handled things differently in those last couple weeks. So can you see where that's just a little bit easier to live with than the other forms? Does that make sense? Guilt and regret? So again, I just think it's really valuable to help people understand the differences between the two. But I will stop rambling. Guilt is like one of my favorite things to talk about. So then we'll move into shame. Shame is kind of a more deep rooted sense of guilt, where if guilt is the feeling of like, I did something wrong, I did a bad thing, shame is more the feeling of, I am bad. Shame is more internalized. It's usually driven by our own sense of self, by our own like kind of deeper rooted insecurities. Oftentimes, shame is also connected to this perception that other people are looking at us, that other people are judging us or watching us. We see shame a lot in families that lose someone to suicide or to overdose. That this is about me. This is about my family. This is deep rooted. There's obviously some problems within us that created this issue, and that's a little bit harder to work with. But as a clinician, I try to focus in on on identity and on legacy and on how we can take these bad experiences that happen to us, and rather than letting them define us, let them be chapters of our lives instead of the whole story. So shame is often something that people feel, and it is kind of that, like a sense of guilt turned deeply inward. Next we have blame. Blame is that experience when we look for a reason. Our human brains really don't like it when things are ambiguous. We don't really like it when things don't make a lot of sense. And so when we go back through that with that detective brain, we go back through the story of what happened. If we don't find fault with our own selves, we may find fault with others. And oftentimes in the case of a sudden death, it might be, blame might be directed at like the systems that the person was involved in, might be directed at the other driver on the road, the whatever force caused the accident, the dealer. It might be like the school system or the mental health system. There's a lot of ways that we can direct blame outward, and I would say that blame itself is not an inherently problematic thing. It is okay to try to get the facts straight. It's okay to ask these kind of questions and go after answers. Where it becomes more challenging is when it's debilitating. When it's too hard to think about other things. When it creates a sense of bitterness that makes it hard to function otherwise. So like it's pretty natural to ask questions, to want to find answers, to try to find some reason that these things had to happen. But generally speaking, what I encourage my clients to recognize is that the therapeutic value is in asking the questions. It's not necessarily in finding the answers, because there's never going to be any one answer that feels satisfying to a grieving person. There's not going to be an answer that makes everything okay. And so encouraging, like, go ahead and ask the questions, but see if you can get to a place where you're okay not having answers to all those questions. That makes sense? Okay, and then anxiety and fear. This is something that I think happens a lot. We as human beings, we like to presume that we are safe and in control of the world, at least of our own world, if not the rest of the world. We really like that illusion. We dwell in it probably better than any other animal species out there. Most non-human species don't actually feel terribly safe in their world, but we create that illusion, and we're really good at living in it until something terrible happens. And then that anxiety, that fear, that sense of like, oh, you know what? A terrible thing happened to me. That means that other terrible things can happen to me. That means that I'm not immune from hard things. And so that can create this feeling of anxiety. In families where there's a loss to suicide, family members of people who die by suicide, their risk for suicide increases. So there is some like legitimate rationale for this increased anxiety. There may be other losses that happen. What we've basically done is we've broken the illusion that the world is a safe and secure place, and that's hard to reconcile with. And then anger. Anger also is a feeling that happens when we are trying to make sense of things that just actually don't make a lot of sense. Anger might be directed in a number of different ways. It might be directed at the person who died, which often also comes with a nice little helping of guilt after acknowledging some of that anger. It may be directed at their networks, the school systems, churches, community groups, those kind of things. It may also be directed at people who may have caused the death, like a prescriber or a dealer. And sometimes it's just kind of directed at the world. Like we don't have any one particular person or entity we feel angry toward, but we just feel anger. And one of the things that I think is really important to know about anger is that it is just an emotion. It has really the same it's an emotion in the same way that joy is an emotion. It's an emotion in the same way that anxiety or other things are emotions. It's really it's not wrong. It's not bad. We kind of get anger a little bit socialized out of us. Like we're taught from a pretty young age that we don't want to express anger, that it's not a great thing. And sorry to be like super stereotypical, but it's a little more true of women and girls who get that anger socialized out of them at a very young age. Boys are taught slightly differently. But nobody really likes to feel anger. And so it's a hard thing to acknowledge, which is why we have about 1 million other words to describe anger. Like, I'm not angry, I'm frustrated. I'm not angry, I'm irritated. That all kind of falls on that spectrum of anger. But what I think is really important to recognize is anger is as natural an emotion as they come. If you've ever been in a room with a newborn, like a baby who has just been born, they used to, the baby is born, the baby makes that first cry that they make. They used to think that was a cry of happiness. Like, I'm so glad to be here. What they kind of figured out is that the first emotion that newborns feel tends to be anger. And that first cry that they make tends to be an angry cry. And when you think about what a baby has gone through to be born, it actually really does make sense. Like they have been taken from a place where they were warm, they were safe, they were protected. Every single one of their needs was met before they even realized what a need was. Everything was fine. And then they're pulled into a place where there's bright lights, there's unfamiliar voices, there's seeing things for the first time. Like it's overwhelming. And that angry response is really just their way of saying, my world that was once safe is now completely terrifying. And that makes me angry. Like that's upsetting. And so when we think about it in that regard, it kind of makes sense that we would feel anger as adults who are going through grief. Our world that once felt safe and stable and normal is now completely new and different. And that is terrifying, and that makes me mad. That makes sense? So anger, just like all the other emotions, really just needs to be felt. It needs to be acknowledged. And what we can do as helpers is give people permission to be angry and to express anger. What we can also do as helpers is encourage them to find safe ways to express their anger. So what I generally encourage my clients to think about is there's really three different ways you can express anger. You can express it in a destructive way, which I don't need to go into examples of all the horrible destructive things that have happened because of anger. You can express it in a neutral way, which is just fine, or you can express it in a constructive way. So I think about groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving is an example of really angry women who decided to take action, and their anger led them to a really constructive action of creating this organization. AFSP, another example of people with some anger that decided to take some constructive action around that. America's Most Wanted, another good example of that. And not that you need to encourage people to start a national nonprofit. That some people can do that, most of us can't. But what we can do is think about, this anger is it gives us energy, and that energy needs to be expended in some way. So, if you can't do something like start a national nonprofit, maybe you can do something constructive, like write a letter. That do something to make your community a better place. Use that energy to do something good. And if you don't have the bandwidth to do something constructive, neutral is just fine. Neutral things that we can do with anger might include like throwing rocks into a river, going to a rage room and breaking some things in a safe way. Those are examples of neutral things, and that's just great. What we want to avoid is the destruction. We want to avoid using that anger to do something destructive to ourselves or to our family or our communities. This is often mediated by a sense of shame, which is, for some people, they may be reluctant to discuss the cause of the death. They may not want to engage with other people. They may not want to, like it says here, participate in support groups or counseling. We live in a world that's kind of likes the microwave version of grief. So, somebody dies and you get your 3 days of bereavement leave, and then you're kind of just expected to come back to work or school and be okay. When what we really know about grief is that it takes a lot longer than that, and it really is a significant adaptive process. But because of that, people often get the message that that their emotions are too much, or that the support is no longer available for them because they've passed some sort of imaginary statute of limitations on how long they're allowed to grieve, and that can also create this isolation. People recognize that others may not want to hear their story or may not want to be there to support them, and so they separate themselves. Or they may think that they're abnormal because they're grieving too much or too long. Those kind of things. That's what can create these feelings of isolation. What I encourage here is just continued support for you all as you're being trained to become grief literate people. My encouragement is, to remember things like special days, anniversaries, things like that, even when it's years down the road, to reach out, make some sort of connection or contact. Be the person that welcomes their expressions of grief, and that can help reduce those feelings of isolation. Okay, so this is just a basic definition of grief. Grief is a normal and natural, though often deeply painful, response to loss. The death of a family member is the most common way we think of loss, but there may be many other significant changes that can involve loss and can cause feelings of grief. So, we really focus at Caring Connections on losses due to death, but an experience like a divorce, a breakup, a move, a job loss, even a job gain, all of those kind of experiences can cause a sense of grief. And so it's just something that's important to recognize. The other thing that I think is very important to note is that grief is it's the experience we have after the loss of somebody that we're attached to. It's not really connected specifically to love. Like, you've probably heard that quote, "Grief is the price we pay for love." And while I think that is probably accurate, it's not fully accurate. We often grieve people that we didn't necessarily have a loving relationship with. We grieve people based really on attachment more than specifically love. The other thing that's important to note is grief is simply the experience we have after a loss. After doesn't have an end point. So we don't really have a point in our lives where we stop grieving. Every day after someone dies is still after. It might be one day after, it might be 20 years after, but it's still after. So we are still technically grieving. Grief is a shapeshifter, and so what it's going to look like in those first couple of days, weeks, or months after a death is going to be different than what it might look like years down the road, but it's still grief. And so just keep that in mind, that there's no real such thing as being done with grief. There's such thing as being, in a different place in grief. Make sense? And I just like this point here, whether spoken or unspoken, grief needs to be addressed. So we need to acknowledge grief. We need to, I think, give people opportunities to talk about it, but also recognize that talking about grief is one way to express grief. It's one of many ways. So, if you're working with someone who's maybe just not much of a talker, perhaps you can help them find other ways to express their grief. Like I've done a lot of work with expressive arts therapy over the years. That's a wonderful way to express grief. Other people may express it through like rhythm or movement or music. They may express it through written word rather than spoken word. So helping grieving people find a way to express themselves is really valuable, and thinking a little bit outside the box. Like, we don't, if they don't want to talk about it, they don't have to talk about it. But let's find some other ways to help them express themselves. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so some different categories, if you will, of grief. So grief may be present grief. This is just typically characterized as related to a death that happened within the fairly recent past, like within the last year. Grief may be past, related to an event that happened years earlier, but there may also be current events or issues that are coming up that maybe exacerbate the grief. For example, I was speaking with someone a couple months ago, and she had lost a 2-year-old daughter 16 years earlier, and she said, this is the year that my daughter would be graduating high school. And that caused a surge in her grief for her. And she was in a place where she was no longer feeling the really acute sense of loss, but she was feeling that more long-term sense of loss. Like, who would this teenage girl be? What would she be doing as she graduates high school? Those kind of things. So we have both that present grief and then past grief. Both can be really difficult. Preparatory grief. This is often what people experience when they're anticipating a loss. So, some of the work we do at Caring Connections is with family caregivers of people living with dementia. And so for them, we offer what we call a pre-loss grief support group, where they have a chance to come together even before their person has died to process some of their grief, and that can be really valuable. And then there's exponential grief, which is just, the impact of multiple losses. So this might be like multiple losses in one tragic event. It may also be multiple losses over a span of time. Both of those can be really challenging. And then, of course, historic trauma, which is both a foundation of challenges with grief and also can be fuel. A lot of people in marginalized groups who maybe have a history of historic trauma are the same people who get really negative messages about their expression of grief, or about the ways that they maybe choose to remember their person who died. So that can be a challenge too. Everybody responds to loss really differently. I know that that's kind of a cliche. Everyone grieves differently, but it is absolutely true. We experience loss differently based on a lot of different factors, based on our relationship with the person who died, based on our history with previous losses, based on our own coping skills, our own mental health, based on whatever circumstances are happening in our lives. So you may have two people like sisters who both lose a mother. They've both technically lost the same person and the same relationship, but their grief maybe manifests really, really differently because of their own relationship with that person and their own personal history and experiences. So no two people grieve alike. There really is not a formula. There's not one right way to grieve. It's very different for everyone, and it's different for us throughout our lives. Like if we lose a parent at 25 and then lose another parent at 50, the way that we're going to experience the loss of both of those parents is going to be different. Couple of things just about what most of us can benefit from. The vast majority of people who are experiencing grief will benefit from these things. So they'll benefit from some form of interpersonal support. This is, friends, other people who you just can get it, can offer some compassion. They may benefit from some form of spiritual support, and pretty much everyone benefits from permission to avoid unhelpful other people. I'm talking about, none of y'all are in this room, but I'm talking about the people who, say things like, hey, it's been 3 days. You should be over it by now. Or like, did you enjoy your vacation when you were at your mom's funeral last week? Those kind of things. I've heard it all. So permission to not engage with those kind of people, because they are simply not helpful.